Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I sort of can't believe it, but it is already October. I don't know how we wound up in October again so quickly because I swear it was just October, like, I don't know, a
Me
month
too.
ago.
Yep.
If you look forward to this podcast every week, we would love it if you would post a review on Apple Podcasts for us. It will help more people to find us. So if you don't mind going to Apple Podcast, searching for us and leaving us a review, that pushes us closer to the top where more people can find us. Today, we're going to be answering your questions. We do that every few weeks. Today, we're doing it again. But before we get to that, I'm excited to welcome my colleague, Karen Spencer, who's a former admissions officer at Georgetown and at Franklin and Marshall. And as I mentioned, she's my colleague, so we work together now. Hi, Karen.
Hi. Nice to see you again.
You too. So in our first segment today, we're talking about state schools and essays. And I will tell you that this was prompted because, as many of our listeners know, I'm going through this process right now with my own son, which is kind of crazy. After
Yes, it
close to
is.
20 years of doing this work, I am now actually going through it with my own child. And I got hung up on Penn State's application. So Penn State has on the Common App, they do not require the main essay on the Common App. So everybody knows you write one essay, you use it for the Common App, and it goes to all of the schools on the Common App. Well, not all of the schools who are on the Common App actually require the essay. And so Penn State does not require the essay. However, in Penn State's application, or in their supplement to the Common App, they have an optional essay prompt that is basically sort of tell us something that information that you didn't have another place to share, more or less is kind of how it's worded. And it got me thinking, if I am challenged by that, if I need to reach out to my colleagues and say, hey, how do you guys handle this when you have students applying to Penn State? Then our listeners must have questions about this. And so that is how you and I come to be talking about state schools and essays. So in terms of getting us started, what's your general sense of how much or how little essays factor into the process at state schools?
Sure. So, I mean, like every other answer we ever give, right? Of course, we always have to start with it depends, right? And we're
Yes.
going to dive into that a little bit further in a minute, I'm sure. Right. So, state schools are not all the same. Some this is going to be more important than others. I think for a lot of students, we're thinking about like the small private schools or super, super selective schools where I almost guarantee it's being read and read closely, especially assuming you're a competitive applicant to begin with. I think here it depends on the school, whether kind of how they read, how competitive of a state school they are, and a few other things. And so I think that's really going to factor in terms of how important this is. I think it's not going to be the be all end all, but I also think, and there's going to be some places I bet it's never even read. And so I think there's
Right.
going to be those schools, and then I think there's schools where this is really going to help a kid on the bubble or not, as the case may be, kind of weed out those kids who took the supplement seriously. So I think it can be a nice litmus test for state schools for whom, it may not be as holistic of a process as it is for other schools, but this is their one opportunity, especially for either some of their selective programs, whether it's their engineering or their business program or whatever it is, that's their thing they're known for at their school, or for kids who are really on the bubble and you're thinking, what do I want to do with this kid? And I know I'm not supposed to say kid. I still say kid. Sorry, I know they're not a
Student.
goat. I know the student. But like what am I going to do with this student who's like a little, if they're like that borderline waitlist admit kid? I think that's definitely something that where the essay might play a real piece.
Right. So I'm going to go back to Penn State for a minute because I think there's a few things here. One of them is that I did sit through a virtual information session for Penn State this summer. And I do not recall, and I didn't take it in my notes, but I don't recall the essay coming up at all. That is generally, in my opinion, a sign that the essay is not really a big part of the process, if it's a part of the process at all. So the fact that it didn't come up, the fact that as they talked about the things to be thinking about and to be focused on, the things that I heard more about were deadlines. And they were test optional and what that means and how to address that in the application. How the fact that you need to select an alternate campus, that's part of their application requirements. All of these different things they covered. They did not talk about the essay. But
I also think an important part there is that their honors program is a separate application too. And I do think that that is, if this is all encompassing and this is deciding scholarships and this is deciding honors programs and this, then the essay may be, used for other things, if not admissions. But here at Penn State, that is not the case.
Well, right. And actually, I was going to point to that. So the first thing, though, is the idea that, so what many of you may not be aware of is when a student applies to a school via the Common App, that does not require the personal statement. You are asked, the applicant is asked, do you want to send along the personal statement or not? So what I have now had students do for Penn State is take their main essay, shorten it to 500 words because the optional Penn State essay is only 500 words, and submit that, and then not send the Common App essay because it's one and the same. I think the alternate is you send the Common App essay and you don't fill out the optional. I think either one can work. And really, my gut is they're not going to read it, but at least it shows that it's a serious application, that you weren't just saying, okay, anyone who doesn't require the essay, I'm just going to send along an application because why not? My parents are willing to spend the money, the $75, the $80. So I'm just going to send it along. But the honors college is a totally different thing. And we don't need to talk about the individual prompts, but what's your sense of that, how important the essays are there?
So Penn State Schreier's College Honors Program would be a whole thing for me right now. I could spend 20 minutes talking about that, and you don't want to hear my thoughts on that. So there are 10 essays for the honors program at Penn State, which I'm just going to float that out there and let that settle in for people. And they're not short either. These are not 100-word, tell me your favorite books. Like, these are essays, like 800-word essays. So I do think, like with other colleges, that would have scared, I was a good student. I would have seen that and be like, nope. Like, Penn State would have been a safety for me, and I still would have been like, yeah, I'm not doing that. So I think it is a real a place to weed out kids who are like, not worth it to me. Listen, I have students who've seen that and have said the same thing, and who would be a great fit for the program, and are like, no, thank you. So I think it is a screen out of just, you're weeding out kids already, kind of like the main essay is, right? Okay, if who actually answered this, and then this is a separate application for them. So I do think when Penn State is different in that, okay, this is one thing for admittance, and then this is a different thing if you want to be in the honors college.
Right.
And so those essays I would definitely take serious. If that's something, if you're like, I like Penn State, but I'm only going if I get in the honors college, then you should spend a lot of time on those essays, because those are the kind of things that are going to make or break that application, right? Because that's one of the only things they have that's different than the rest of the application.
And, over time, it's an excellent honors college. I've seen students choose Penn State and the honors college over some other highly, highly attractive options, including Penn and where I used to work and schools like that, because it's a great school and the price is really attractive when you compare it to what you'd be paying at some of those schools. So I think the bottom line message here is that for their general admissions process, which is fairly numbers based, the essay is going to not really weigh in. But for an honors college where you are creating a community, where it's something that's much more highly sought after, where they require 10 essays, which is kind of crazy. I don't know. I'm trying to think.
I don't want to talk about it. It makes me angry.
That requires so many. That's a lot. All right. So that's Penn State. Today is not about Penn State. Today is more general than that. But why don't we talk a little bit about schools, some of the big state schools or bigger state schools that we know are more popular, where the sense is that essays are clearly part of the process. Could you walk us through a few of those?
So I think, when I always say, when we're talking about whether essays matter, we're not talking about the following kinds of schools. We're not talking about the UCs, right? The UCs say they read them. We know they read them.
Yes.
The University of Michigan, the University of Virginia, the schools like that are particularly selective. Any of those, I think any state school that admits maybe 25% or less of its applicant pool, right? You should assume that essay, like any selective private school, is reading that essay, and it's factoring in some capacity. I think that's a given, right? I think of those schools almost like private schools. I think where it becomes then a little bit more tricky are those not Michigan's, not UVA's, but kind of your next tier, right? Your University of Wisconsin, UMass, Amherst. Those are where Purdue, especially for engineering, schools that are not, Berkeley, but this isn't going through a computer and that's it, probably. Like there's somewhere, this is where we're in a little bit of no man's land of what are we actually doing with that? I think those are the trickiest ones to kind of really wrap your mind around how selective or how important the essay has to be for those. I think my personal philosophy on that is, and I know you have thoughts on this, but I think if you're going to a really selective program, so if you want to be an English major at Purdue, do I think that essay is going to play a major role? Maybe not, if I'm being honest.
Right.
If you're an engineering major at Purdue, which, that's when it becomes really super selective. Do I think that essay may come into more of have more weight? Yes, I do.
Right. Computer science, things like that.
Science, anything that your college is known for that is having, is going to be much more selective. The Kelley School of Business at IU,
yes,
right? That is going to be a much more selective program than being, say, a history major might be. Nothing against history majors. It's just, that's the way it is at IU.
You've just named my major and my husband's major. See?
Well, there we go.
And we do all right, people. So it's not like you can't work.
I was a psych major. You'll be fine. You'll be totally fine. So you will be employed, I promise. So yeah, I think those are schools that are more interesting to think about how selective is not only this school, but in this program within the greater context. And I think that's where essays at those kinds of schools definitely may come into play.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's fair. I also think if a school has supplemental essays, which is what we're really talking about with these schools, that is something to pay attention to. They may actually not really be reading. They may ask you to submit your personal essay. They may not have the time to read that, but they may have the time to read the supplements. And so I'm not suggesting that you don't do a thorough or good job on your main essay, because there are plenty of schools where that is going to be really important. But what I am saying is that if you're applying to schools that have supplemental essay questions, you should be responding to them, especially when they're specific, right? The thing about that, not to harp on Penn State, but the thing about the Penn State one is it's not specific at all. It's just very like, if there's something important, right? If there's something important you need us to know, let us know what it is. Whereas at UMass Amherst, they are specifically asking, why did you select this major? Purdue, same. Actually, if you're applying to both those schools, they essentially have the same two prompts. But and why here, right? That's a very different type of question than just tell us about yourself.
Right. Right.
And yeah. And when you see that, I think that's a sign you need to be more. You need to pay attention to it.
Be more thoughtful of it, right? Especially the UMass Amherst. It's a 100-word essay.
Right.
Do it well. It's 100 words. Pay attention.
This is not hard.
No.
Well,
do it well.
It might feel hard. It's not hard. Hey, you could be doing 10 essays for Penn State's Honors College.
Exactly. Exactly. Everything is relative, people.
Think about it like from that perspective. So, with that in mind, I think there's another sort of interesting and I thing that comes up, and one that for me, I actually sat with someone in the Clemson admissions office this summer, and one thing that she shared with me is that the essay is not a part of their formal process, but they do look at it. So what's your take on that sort of assessment?
I won't lie. And I like Clemson. I have a lot of kids who like Clemson. So this is not unique to Clemson.
I think Clemson is great, and it's not unique to Clemson. I loved it.
It's not remotely unique to Clemson. I think, so a good point of this, I asked our colleague Kenan, because he used to work at a relatively not super selective state school. And I said, what did you do with the essay? He's like, well, we definitely read it. And then I said, okay. And what did you do with it? He was like, kind of make sure you didn't confess to like committing murder. He was like, it was like, really, he's like, I don't really remember. We did read it, but I don't remember ever really doing anything with it. And so, again, I think it's, just to look for big red flags, anything like that. So I do think it's something, again, making sure you did it. Maybe you're a recruited athlete and the admissions person is making sure you can string 2 sentences together. I was a recruited athlete, so I'm not making fun. Don't send hate mail. So I'm not saying anything, but or you're getting in for some manner of fashion that's not strictly academic, right? I want to make sure you can string 2 sentences together, that you've given some thought to this. But I think for a lot of schools, this isn't going to play. And I at least appreciate it when schools are honest. I had a student go to Virginia Tech recently who they were pretty much admitted, we're not reading these. And I was like, okay. And I think that's hard because as parents, I would think, then why do you have these specific questions? Because in this regard, right, Virginia Tech has very specific questions. They also ask 100 and say, give you 120 words. And that's also another conversation for another day. But, I can understand the confusion of these are really specific questions too. I think, in Virginia Tech's case back in the day, they got a new provost. They really had this new mindset and they really did want to kind of have these essays and be able to part of it. I suspect there, though, that they simply realized they didn't have time to read them, right? These are massive schools with massive amounts of applications, and you can't go over them with a fine tooth comb. I could barely get through my essay load at Georgetown and get through all of that. So I think in some guys, it's a good idea. And maybe for us liver of kids, it really matters. But for, I think, the Clemsons and Virginia Techs of the world, I don't probably think this is, again, unless you confess to being a sociopath, probably not going to matter.
Well, this brings me actually to Pitt, which is interesting. So Pitt used to have a couple of optional supplemental questions that they asked. Then those went away. And this year, they're not even, and I profess that I'm not positive if this is a new thing this year or if it's actually been this way for a little bit, but they don't require the Common App main essay. However, if you're in Pitt's supplement, they clearly spell out that if you want to be considered for merit, you either need to submit the main essay for this Common App or submit a different essay, and they have a prompt there that you can write to if you would like to. So they're not requiring the essay, which tells me it's not a factor in their initial decision. But when they go to figure out merit, they want the essay. So that's the other thing. And there is a whole group of schools out there, and Karen, you and I were talking about them, but I mean, maybe you can tell us a few of schools where they're not requiring the essay at all, and they don't have any supplemental questions. You have the option of submitting your essay, you don't. How do you usually address that at some of these schools?
I think first of all, if you already have an essay, send it, right? You already wrote it, just send it. What's the harm? You already have it done. I think for a student who is really exceptional and probably a slam dunk, if for some reason they don't have an essay, I can't imagine why you wouldn't, but maybe you don't.
Right.
That kid's probably fine, but now you may not be considered for merit or the honors program. This is where those holistic, everything we want to know, we're asking for here. You don't have to do it. But if honors college or merit-based money is based on this application, then I think you want to put your very best foot forward. I also think if you're on the bubble, again, probably behooves you to submit an essay. So for a lot of different reasons, whether you're actually borderline not admissible or a good contender for merit, right? Those are two different kinds of students in the applicant pool. Both have a decent reason sometimes for submitting an essay. So, if there's not one offered or they say we're not reading it, fine. There's a place like Arizona State comes to mind. I mean, Arizona State will give you an answer in 4 days. Nobody's reading
They're not reading that essay.
Nobody's ever reading that, right? That went through a computer and shot out a letter to you.
And by the way, they don't ask for it. So they are not being hypocritical.
Correct. Yeah. So I think for schools that make it optional, and again, especially if you're borderline or especially if this is going to potentially be used for merit, why wouldn't you do it? So
yeah. I think that is the bottom line. Unless you're someone who decided to submit applications at the last minute and your reason for applying is specifically that they do not require an essay, which is a whole thing in and of itself that we should probably talk about. Yeah, another conversation, but there's really no reason why you wouldn't submit it. What is the worst that happens is no one looks at it. But the best case that happens is they need it for something that will have a positive impact on you, like merit or like being on the bubble and getting in, and then it's there and you don't have to worry about it.
Yep, I agree.
I don't know if we've offered enlightenment in any way, shape, or form.
They may be more confused now after
particular.
This. They may be like, oh Lord.
I think the bottom line is if a school, send your essay, you've got one. And if they have supplemental questions that are pretty specific, unless you're going to call every school and confirm that they are indeed reading it, you probably should write it and do a nice job with it.
Agreed.
And if you are interested in learning more about the personal inquiry questions,
Oh, for the University of California.
for the University of California. Did I get that right? No, I want to call it the personal inquiry questions, but it's the personal insight questions.
PIQs.
PIQs. If you want to learn more about our suggestions for approaching those, we actually covered that on the show that aired on September 2nd, so you can go back into our archives and find it. Karen, thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
Absolutely. All right, we are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are answering your questions. So do not go away.